48 deaths in 5 years. The dark secret of Amy Archer-Gilligan's nursing home. The coffin was lighter than it should have been. No one mentioned it at the funeral. Not the pastor, not the pallbearers, not the grieving niece who'd paid for the mahogany casket. They lowered Franklin Andrews into Connecticut soil on a grey morning in May 1914, and everyone agreed he looked peaceful. Too peaceful for a man who'd been screaming about stomach pains just 3 days earlier. It was the third funeral that month at Archer home for the elderly and infirm. The flowers were still fresh on the previous grave. Something was happening in Windsor, Connecticut, something quiet, something that smelled like home-cooked meals and lavender soap, something that for 5 years no one had the language to name. But if you walked past the white Victorian house on Prospect Street and counted the hearses, you'd notice a pattern. The elderly went in smiling. They came out in boxes, and the woman who ran the home, Amy Archer-Gilligan, never stopped smiling either. By 1914, 48 people had died under her care. At first, everyone called it mercy, then someone started counting. The neighbors had noticed, of course. How could they not? The funeral processions became a regular sight on Prospect Street, black carriages pulling up to the white Victorian, hushed conversations on the porch, the smell of lilies drifting through open windows. But this was a nursing home. Death was expected, natural, part of the business. What they didn't notice was the timing, the pattern hidden in plain sight. Amy Archer-Gilligan wasn't born a monster. She was born Amy Duggan in 1873 in Milton, Connecticut, to Irish immigrant parents who raised her to be respectable, religious, and hardworking. She attended church every Sunday. She helped her mother bake bread for neighbors. She learned early that kindness opened doors and that people trusted a woman who smiled. She married James Archer in 1897, a man with modest ambitions and a gentle demeanor. Together, they opened Archer Home for the Elderly and Infirm in 1907, a private nursing facility in Newington, Connecticut, before relocating to the larger Victorian house in Windsor. The home was everything families wanted: clean linens, rocking chairs on the porch. Amy cooked meals herself, read to residents, held their hands when they grew frightened in the night. She wasn't just a caretaker, she was a daughter figure, a companion, a comfort in the final chapters of life. Families paid her gratefully, sometimes as much as $1,000 upfront for lifetime care, a promise that their aging parents would never be abandoned. And Amy kept her promises. She cared for them until the very end. The very quick end. James Archer died suddenly in 1910. Heart failure, the doctor said. He'd been complaining of stomach pains for weeks, growing weaker, unable to keep food down. Amy nursed him herself, brought him special broths and tonics, but nothing helped. He died in their bedroom on a Tuesday morning, and Amy wept at his funeral like any devoted wife would. She inherited the business and continued alone, her reputation only growing. Widows and widowers, the elderly and infirm, they came to her because she understood loss. She'd lost too. In 1913, she remarried. Michael Gilligan, a wealthy widower, seemed like a perfect match. He moved into the home with her, helped manage the books, shared her bed. 3 months later, he was dead. Acute gastric illness, they said. The same symptoms James had suffered. Amy became a widow again. She kept his name, Archer-Gilligan, and kept working. And the bodies kept coming. By 1914, the death rate at Archer Home was 5 times higher than any nursing facility in Connecticut. But Amy kept smiling, and families kept coming. If you think this is just another story about a killer nurse, you're already missing the point. Subscribe now, because what Amy did wasn't just murder, it was a business model. And what comes next will show you how easily evil hides behind kindness. Nellie Pierce didn't trust easily. When her brother Franklin Andrews decided to move into Archer Home in April 1914, she'd been skeptical. Franklin was 60 years old, recently widowed, lonely but healthy. He had a bad knee and trouble sleeping, but he wasn't dying. He'd paid Amy $1,000 up front, his life savings, for a contract guaranteeing care for the rest of his life. However long that may be, Amy had said warmly, shaking his hand. It was 5 weeks. Nellie visited him twice in that time. The first visit, Franklin seemed content. a little tired but content. The room was clean, the bed comfortable, and Amy had been so attentive. She'd prepared his favorite meals, she said, made sure he took his medicine. The second visit, 2 weeks later, Franklin was bedridden, pale, sweating, clutching his stomach. Amy said it was his digestion, age catching up. She'd been giving him special tonic to help. He'd be fine. He wasn't fine. Franklin Andrews died on May 30, 1914. Cause of death, gastric distress. Nellie stood at his grave and felt the wrongness settle into her bones like cold water. Her brother had been healthy. He'd walked into that house on his own 2 feet. 5 weeks later, he was dead, and Amy Archer-Gilligan had his $1,000. Nellie went to the authorities. At first, they dismissed her. Grief, they said, suspicion born from loss. Amy Archer-Gilligan was a respected member of the community, a churchgoer, a caregiver. She volunteered at charity events. She donated to the church. The idea that she could be harming anyone was absurd. But Nellie wouldn't let it go. She demanded an investigation. She demanded an autopsy. And finally, begrudgingly, the state agreed. They exhumed Franklin Andrews' body in July 1914. What they found in his stomach wasn't a disease, it was a decision. Arsenic. Not trace amounts, not accidental contamination, lethal concentrations of arsenic trioxide, enough to kill a man 3 times over. Franklin Andrews hadn't died of old age or bad digestion. He'd been poisoned, slowly, deliberately, and the only person who'd been feeding him in his final days was Amy. The investigation exploded. Authorities began looking into other deaths at Archer home. They pulled records, interviewed families, examined ledgers, and they found him, Carl Gosley, the local druggist. He kept meticulous records, as all pharmacists did, and his records showed something damning. Between 1911 and 1916, Amy Archer-Gilligan had purchased alarming quantities of arsenic, pounds of it. She claimed it was for rats. The old Victorian house had a pest problem, but Gosley's numbers didn't lie. She'd bought enough arsenic to kill 100 people. And in 5 years, 48 people had died in her care. The state ordered more exhumations. They dug up 5 more graves. Every single body tested positive for arsenic poisoning. Levels so high that death would have come within hours to days, masked by symptoms that looked exactly like natural illness in the elderly: nausea, stomach pain, weakness, organ failure. The doctors who'd signed the death certificates were horrified. They'd trusted Amy. They'd believed her when she described symptoms. They'd never thought to question. On May 8, 1916, Amy Archer-Gilligan was arrested and charged with the murder of Franklin Andrews. She smiled at the officers. "This is a mistake," she said calmly. "I've only ever helped people." Most people scroll past stories like this thinking, someone must have known. They did. They stayed silent. For years, families trusted a woman who saw them as inventory. Don't scroll past this. Subscribe so you never forget how silence protects monsters. Because Amy didn't work alone. Society did. The trial began in June 1917. The courtroom in Hartford was packed. Reporters filled the gallery. Families of the dead sat in the front rows, some weeping, some stone-faced. Amy sat at the defense table in a dark dress, her hair pinned neatly, her expression serene. She looked like someone's grandmother. She looked harmless. The prosecution built their case methodically. They focused on Franklin Andrews. The evidence was strongest there. But they painted a larger picture, a pattern of death that stretched back years. They called Carl Gosley to the stand. He testified about the arsenic purchases, the frequency, the quantities. "She said it was for rats," he told the court. "But no one has that many rats. I asked her once if she'd considered traps instead. She said arsenic was more efficient." The word hung in the air, efficient. They called the medical examiner who'd autopsied Franklin's body. He described the arsenic concentrations, the tissue damage, the unmistakable signs of poisoning. "This was not accidental," he said. "This was sustained, deliberate administration over multiple days. Someone was feeding him poison regularly." They called surviving residents, those who'd paid by the week instead of upfront. One woman, trembling and elderly, described Amy's special tea. She always brought it to those who weren't feeling well, the woman said. She'd say it would help them rest. Some of them never woke up. Another resident, a man in his 70s, recalled Amy's moods. When someone paid up front, she was very attentive at first, very caring, but then she'd get impatient, like she was waiting for something, and then they'd get sick, and she'd be sad but not surprised, never surprised. And then they revealed the financial records. Amy's ledgers were meticulous. She tracked every payment, every resident, every expense, and the numbers told a story more chilling than any testimony. Residents who paid the $1,000 upfront for lifetime care had an average stay of 2 to 3 months before death. Residents who paid $7 per week, ongoing payments, lived for years. The correlation was undeniable. If you paid up front, you died fast. If you kept paying weekly, you kept living. Amy had turned elder care into a profit maximization scheme. The faster they died, the more she kept. She'd made over $100,000 in 5 years, nearly $3 million in today's currency. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as the prosecutor laid out the math. This wasn't a caregiver who'd snapped. This wasn't a mercy killing gone wrong. This was systematic. This was business. But the defense had a strategy, respectability. Amy's lawyer painted her as a devoted caretaker, overwhelmed by the burden of caring for the dying. He suggested the arsenic was for pests, that the deaths were coincidental, that grief-stricken families were looking for someone to blame. These were elderly, sick people, the defense argued. They were going to die anyway. Mrs. Archer-Gilligan gave them comfort in their final days. She should be thanked, not condemned. The prosecutor stood. He was holding a photograph, Franklin Andrews, healthy and smiling, taken 3 weeks before he entered Archer home. "Does this look like a dying man?" he asked the jury. The courtroom went silent. And then the prosecution called their final witness, a woman who shouldn't have existed, a woman who, by all accounts, should have been dead. Her name was Mary. She was 72 years old, frail but sharp-eyed. She'd lived at Archer home for 6 months in 1915, paying weekly. One day, Amy brought her a special tonic, said it would help her sleep better. Mary tasted it. It was bitter, wrong. She stopped drinking it. She poured it into her chamber pot when Amy wasn't looking, and she lived. She took the stand slowly, leaning on a cane. The courtroom watched her every move. When she finally sat, the prosecutor asked her a single question. "Why did you stop drinking the tonic Mrs. Archer-Gilligan gave you?" Mary looked directly at Amy. "Because she told me it would help me sleep forever," she said, "and I wasn't ready to sleep forever." The room went completely still. Amy's expression didn't change. She sat there, hands folded, as if she were listening to a weather report. No tears, no shock, no remorse. The prosecutor pressed, "Did Mrs. Archer-Gilligan seem upset when you refused the tonic?" "No," Mary said quietly. "She just stopped offering it, and she stopped visiting my room as much. I think she moved on to someone easier." In that moment, the jury saw it. Not a caregiver, not a mercy killer, a predator who selected victims based on convenience. The defense tried to discredit Mary. They suggested she was confused, that her memory was failing, that she'd imagined the bitterness. But Mary was unshakable. She remembered everything, the taste, the words, the look in Amy's eyes. "She wasn't trying to help me sleep," Mary said firmly. "She was trying to help me die." The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours. Guilty. Amy Archer-Gilligan was sentenced to death by hanging. But the story didn't end there. In 1918, her legal team successfully argued that procedural errors during the trial warranted a retrial. The second trial resulted in a guilty verdict again, but this time, the sentence was commuted to life in prison. Some said it was due to doubts about her mental state. Others said the state simply didn't want the spectacle of hanging a woman. Amy was sent to Connecticut State Prison. She never admitted guilt, not once, not in 30 years of incarceration. She died in 1962, at the age of 93, older than most of her victims ever got to be. The aftermath of Amy Archer-Gilligan's crimes rippled far beyond Windsor, Connecticut. Her case led to sweeping reforms in nursing home regulations. States began requiring regular inspections, background checks, and financial audits of elder care facilities. Licensing boards were established. Oversight increased. The idea that someone could operate a care home without supervision became unthinkable. But for the families of her victims, no regulation could undo what had been done. 48 confirmed deaths. Some investigators believed the real number was closer to 60, maybe more. Many graves were never exhumed. Many families never knew the truth. The victims, men and women who'd worked hard their whole lives, who'd saved money for a peaceful retirement, who'd trusted a smiling woman with kind eyes, were reduced to case numbers and newspaper headlines. Their names are mostly forgotten now, but their deaths weren't meaningless. They exposed a crack in the foundation of society. The elderly, the vulnerable, the inconvenient, they could vanish, and no one would ask why. Amy didn't invent that indifference, she just exploited it. And she wasn't alone. Her story inspired the famous play and film Arsenic and Old Lace, a dark comedy about sweet old ladies who poison lonely men. The fiction made people laugh. The reality had made people die. Years later, researchers would find that Amy had shown signs of what we now recognize as psychopathy: charm, manipulation, lack of empathy, superficial relationships. She saw people as objects, profit centers, problems to be solved. And she solved them with arsenic and a smile. One detail haunts more than the rest. After Amy's arrest, investigators searched Archer home top to bottom. In the kitchen, they found her recipe book. Between the pages for apple pie and beef stew, there were handwritten notes about dosages, how much arsenic to add to tea, how long it would take to work, how to mask the taste with honey or lemon. She'd been experimenting, perfecting her method, for years. The recipes were written in the same careful handwriting as her grocery lists and prayer journals, clinical, methodical, as routine as baking bread. Because what happened in Windsor wasn't just Amy's crime, it was ours. We built a world where the vulnerable could vanish and no one would ask why. We built a system where profit mattered more than people. We built a culture where the elderly were invisible until they were dead. Amy Archer-Gilligan didn't break that system, she understood it. And she used it to kill. The residents who survived her told similar stories in the years after her arrest. They remembered how Amy would prioritize certain residents over others, how her smile would fade when someone lingered too long past their expected date of death, how she'd become irritated when weekly payers asked for special meals or extra attention. One survivor recalled Amy muttering under her breath after a resident who'd paid upfront celebrated his third month at the home. "Still here," she'd said, shaking her head, as if his survival were an inconvenience, a failure of planning. Another remembered Amy joking with a visitor about how some people just don't know when it's their time. Everyone had laughed. No one understood what she really meant. If this story shook you, don't just move on to the next video. Subscribe so these 48 voices aren't buried twice, because Amy Archer-Gilligan died in prison, but the systems that protected her, they're still here. And if you won't subscribe, tell us why in the comments. Maybe silence has its reasons, or maybe you just don't want to admit how easy it is to look away. When Amy was finally arrested and the home was closed, investigators found something in the front parlor that no one had thought to remove: a rocking chair. It sat by the window, worn smooth by years of use. Amy had sat there every evening, watching the street, waiting for the next family to arrive with their elderly loved one in tow. The chair stayed in that house for years after she was gone. Some say it's still there, in whatever building occupies that lot now, an empty seat where a killer once smiled and waved at her neighbors. And in 1962, when Amy Archer-Gilligan died in her prison cell, she was 93 years old, the same age as some of her victims. The state gave her what she never gave them: time. But somewhere in Windsor, Connecticut, there's a cemetery with unmarked grave. graves that were never opened, bodies that were never tested. And no one knows how many of them were hers. The files remain sealed. The full list of suspected victims was never released. Some families still don't know. They visit grave and leave flowers, believing their loved ones died peacefully in their sleep. Maybe they did. Or maybe they drank the tea. In the end, Amy's only legacy is a warning that evil doesn't always announce itself with violence or rage. Sometimes it wears an apron. Sometimes it bakes cookies. Sometimes it holds your hand and tells you everything will be all right. And sometimes it poisons your tea while smiling at you. The residents of Windsor eventually moved on. The house was sold, renovated, repurposed. Life continued. But every now and then, someone would walk past that lot and remember the funerals, remember the woman in the window, remember how easy it was to trust her. Because that's the real horror of Amy Archer-Gilligan's story. Not that she killed, but that she was so very good at making people believe she cared. But if you think Amy Archer-Gilligan was the only caretaker who turned mercy into murder, you're wrong. Next time, we're covering the nurse who killed over 400 patients and almost got away with it. You won't want to miss that.